But that's okay, you don't need to see me. So I'm here to introduce Dan Snyder. Dan is one of our newer volunteers because he retired. I assume that's why we see more of him now. And he helps down at the farm during festival days. He helps do the interpretive art for the stills in the basement of the Schaeffer House. And if you have not been there, you should go and find out more, because that's a very interesting part about that house and that heritage. Dan is here to talk about Stiegel, Henry William Stiegel, or Heinrich Wilhelm Stiegel, and he'll tell you all about that, and Stiegel glass, and a little bit about why Stiegel's important to Schaefferstown. So probably all of you were bitten by the history bug at different points in your life. And for me, it was a little later in life when I wanted to know more about my house, which I still don't really know when it was built. But it's the journey, not the destination for many of us, for research and learning. And this is the big thing. We always want to learn more, and so that's why we're here, right? Now, Dan's interest in learning history began when he was a boy, and his parents loved collecting antiques, and he learned about bottles left over, in somebody's bottle dump. Before we had trash collection, where did it go? In the backyard dump, along stone walls, in old cellar holes. And if you live in an old house and haven't looked for the dump at your house, you're really missing something, because I'm sure it's there someplace. So Dan started bottle collecting as a boy and a young man, and things grew from there. And as he said, he's been digging in the dirt ever since. So he has helped at Elizabeth Furnace, and those of you who are not familiar, that's a few miles down Route 501 on the left. The furnace is no longer there, and he'll tell you all about that. But they have been doing archaeology down there for many years, and I think you said 19 years you've been helping with that. And I don't remember, my sister-in-law asked me, why do you do that? Why bother? And I said, you learn so much how people lived just by looking at what they lost or threw away. So, anyhow, let's give a round of applause to Dan. We'll keep learning.
Up here. Make sure I don't yank her out of her chair. Well, yes, digging in the dirt had quite an effect on my life, and I came to learn and appreciate the impact that those who have gone before us have on our lives today, and I've continued in that vein since. So today we're going to learn a little bit about Henry Stiegel and the early days of our country drew immigrants from around the world. Each of them brought hope, a dream, and a vision. And Henry Wilhelm Stiegel was among those people. And this is a small slice of his story from iron to glass. So Providence goes before Henry. In May of 1729, his father, John Frederick, and wife, Dorothea Elizabeth, were from the Cologne region of Germany. They became parents to their first child, Henry Willhelm. During Henry's childhood, there were a lot of things taking place, both in Europe and in the American colonies in Pennsylvania, that would facilitate Henry's eventual vision and what his future would be in this land. So while Henry was growing up in Germany, James Logan, a governor, I believe, of Pennsylvania, William Penn's secretary, and later to be mayor of Philadelphia, purchases 1,400 acres in Penn's Woods. A portion of this tract, 729 acres, would pass to his daughter Sarah, and then to her daughter and son-in-law, Isaac and Mary Norris, in 1754. This land was being shepherded through the ownership of several individuals until it came to Henry Stiegel and Charles and Alexander Stedman, who purchased that 729-acre tract in 1762, and that would become the town of Manheim in the fall of that year. In 1734, Peter Grubb discovers and begins mining iron ore and building the Cornwall iron furnace in 1742. A portion of this mine would eventually be designated to supply another iron furnace nearby, and that was established in 1750 by Jacob Huber, a German immigrant to Lititz. So all these things were happening during Stiegel's life that would greatly impact him carrying out his vision here in Pennsylvania. Now sadly, Henry's father, John Frederick, died when Henry was only 12. And Henry also lost 4 other siblings before their venture to America. So despite such losses, Henry was able to be educated in the way of a gentleman, which was very important as it would affect him throughout his life and open doors for him. In November of 1749, Henry boarded the ship Nancy in Rotterdam with his mother and his younger brother Anthony, just the 3 of them. Arriving in Philadelphia in August of 1750, they settled in Heidelberg, which we know as Schaefferstown. His young life in the Cologne region also influenced Henry's vision in major ways. Now, Cologne, Germany had Roman roots, including glassmaking. It was the oldest major city north of the Alps. It was originally a number of small communities that grew and meshed together in a haphazard development to become Cologne. It served as home for several major cathedrals and was a major glassmaking center. And you can see this image of Cologne from 1411. It was really a higgledy-piggledy kind of place as far as the development as a city. Now, located south of Cologne was Manheim, Germany. Manheim had been destroyed by a fire in 1698. It was rebuilt between 1720 and 1760, the years of Henry's coming of age in Germany. And they used modern town planning concepts that came about during the Renaissance. In contrast to Cologne, Manheim was viewed as a very modern city for people of the day. Stiegel witnessed this contrast from where he grew up and the city of Manheim and what it became, and this influenced his vision for the town that he would eventually establish here in America. Manheim, Germany was a city of squares. Using Renaissance influence, this German city had a focus on beauty and placemaking, which is a big buzzword in city urban development today. It was a city of squares, using organized grid pattern as a plan for growth. The city established political authority, influence, and reputation. Music was an integral part of this city and played an important role in its popularity. Germans considered the city of Manheim a desirable place to live, and Henry learned that lesson. Manheim was also a musical center. They had a large orchestra and opera company established by Elector Charles III, Philip. They had virtuoso talent that was considered equal with Vienna and Berlin. They used a court composition style which was developed under Johann Stamitz, who was the electoral director of instrumental music. And here you see an image of one of two harpsichords in Stiegel's instrument collection. Now, he developed this collection after he was established here in Pennsylvania. But at one point, he had a collection of musical instruments valued between 300 and 400 pounds. Now, this was in an era when a skilled craftsman made maybe 30 pounds in a year's time. So he had a tremendous musical instrument collection that was used in the music ministry that he was involved with. So Stiegel's relationships started even on the ship as they were coming here to America. He arrived in Philadelphia in August of 1750 on the ship Nancy. The ship was owned by the Stedman brothers, Charles and Alexander Stedman. They were ship captains and merchants in Philadelphia. They were responsible for bringing about 4,800 male immigrants to Pennsylvania between 1731 and 1754. They either owned or leased 14 ships to accomplish that. When you consider women and children, it was probably close to 10,000 or more that they were responsible for bringing here to America, including Henry Stiegel, his mother and brother. Stiegel established a relationship with the Stedman brothers through this journey, possibly serving as a clerk for the Stedmans upon arrival in Philadelphia. In 1764, Stiegel became a founding member of the Pennsylvania German Society, an organization that assisted German immigrants in coming to America. And this was another step forward, an important role for him to play, as he would need to attract skilled German glassmakers that knew that craft to come here. Here you can see in these images an artist's depiction of what Philadelphia may have looked like in 1750, and as close as I could get to what the ship Nancy might have looked like back then. Stiegel's relationships continue. The Stedman brothers were growing in influence in Philadelphia as merchants and as transportation for thousands of German immigrants. Charles Stedman married the daughter of Dr. Thomas Graham, Anne Diggs Graham, in 1748 or 49. Now, Dr. Graham was a physician, and he was the physician for the Port Authority in Philadelphia, a very influential position. This lovely Georgian townhouse that's pictured in these pictures originally was built by Charles Stedman in 1765, and it was purchased soon thereafter by Philadelphia's Patriot Mayor Samuel Powell in 1769. Now, Powell had traveled around the world prior to his return to Philadelphia to become mayor, and he at that time owned about 60 properties in Philadelphia, but it was this home that Charles Stedman built that he chose for his own personal home, and immediately he went about to make improvements to it. Stiegel's relationship with the Stedman brothers opened doors for Henry with the movers and shakers of colonial Philadelphia, and would provide critical capital he would need for the coming years. So that was a skill that Henry developed in finding people to provide the capital to carry out his vision. Upon Powell's purchase of the home, he went about to embellish it because it was to become a major center of social hubbub for the elite of Philadelphia. In 1770, Powell employed the notable Philadelphia carver and craftsman Hercules Courtenay to do some of the carving for the Powell House at the price of 60 pounds. So that was like 2 years' labor for one craftsman, just for that one job. The photos above show this detail and matching detail on a Stiegel stove that was dated in 1769. In 2019, I was in Philadelphia for a work conference, and that's the first that I toured the Powell House. And as soon as I walked in the room that had this fireplace, I immediately noticed the breastplate of the fireplace, this image portrayed of a dog, and it's actually from Aesop's fable. And I knew immediately it was the same image that was on a Stiegel stove. So here you can see the third on the far right there, a typical stove plate that was being done in this area of Pennsylvania by people like Jacob Huber. Stiegel was expanding the market for his products by choosing the Rococo design that was very all the rage in Philadelphia at that time, and probably using Hercules Courtenay to make the molds for his stoves to portray that. So this is another way that Stiegel was thinking ahead, visioning ahead, and expanding the market from what his father-in-law had established. Speaking of his father-in-law, Jacob Huber. Jacob arrived in Lancaster County in 1733. He built a tavern on Newport Road north of Lidditz in 1735. He was also instrumental in the construction of Newport Road and Furnace Hills Pike. Both of these roads would be essential for the transportation of products from the iron furnace that he intended to build north of Lidditz. And as well, Cornwall Iron Furnace, which opened in 1742. In 1750, Jacob Huber opened Elizabeth Furnace, with Peter Grubb providing the iron ore needed from the Cornwall mines. In Cornwall, the mines there consisted of Big Hill, Middle Hill, and Grassy Hill. And on the northwestern side of Big Hill was a mine developed called Elizabeth Mine, and that was strictly for the use of Elizabeth Furnace. Here you can see an image of what was the Four Seasons bed and breakfast on Newport Road, and an image supposedly of Henry Stiegel that was in the ownership of the owners of the B&B at that time. In 1752, Henry began working for Huber as a clerk. Jacob Huber built the house that you see here in 1746, and the lower image shows the building on the left. That's the charcoal barn for the iron furnace. Behind that is the Huber house. Behind that is the stables. The stables has now been turned into an event venue, and the property has been renovated for that purpose. Eventually, Stiegel would marry his Huber's daughter later in 1752. He was a quick study, I guess you could say. And the person who would eventually buy Elizabeth Furnace, Robert Coleman, also followed in Henry's footsteps by marrying his boss's daughter. It was unusual for the community of ironmasters to allow things to get out of the family. Henry being able to get into an ironmaster family was unusual, and also speaks to his credibility and interest in carrying out his vision. So Stiegel advanced the variety and quality of the iron produced at Elizabeth Furnace. He expanded his iron interests with Charming Forge, that you might also have known as Tuppelhoek and Eisenhammer. He eventually acquired over 10,000 acres of land. Now, why would he buy so much land? Timber. To operate an iron furnace, it would take an acre of timber made into charcoal to keep the furnace in blast for one day. So that's why he had to have a lot of land, because they were consuming a lot of timber. Eventually, Robert Coleman would own 30,000 acres of land. Eventually, Henry would expand the market for iron to the Caribbean for the manufacture of iron vessels for the production of sugar and rum. There's a Bermuda connection also to Henry Stiegel, and this was uncovered by students and staff at Millersville University. There was believed to be a glut of iron on the market at that time prior to the Revolution. So Stiegel advertised in the Philadelphia papers for the manufacture of iron products used in making rum and sugar. Bermuda was a major crossroads in the 18th century for trade, both to and from the colonies, and this is called the Atlantic World Trade, and it's a whole thing that historians and archaeologists are focused on. Millersville University students organized digs to Bermuda to document by artifact things that they were finding in documents they had done in research. So here we have Charles and Alexander Stedman again, merchants and investors. They were creditors of Stiegel's. They had a relationship with John Stamper, who was a Philadelphia ship owner, like the Stedmans, and he had Stamper's Wharf in Philadelphia. He had a relationship with John Dixon, who was a Bermuda merchant. So Stiegel traded some of his iron and glass to pay his creditors, which ended up in being transferred for illegal French goods and slaves by bypassing the authorities at the main port. So John Dixon's home and warehouse was at the bottom of the fish hook of Bermuda in that bay, the bottom arrow. The main port was at the other end of the island. So ships would go to his warehouse and make the exchange of goods there. And then when those ships came back to the colonies, they had immigrants on them, probably from the Stedmans, and they claimed those illegal goods as personal property of the immigrants. If there's a will, there's a way. So here you can see pictures of the Dixon's home and warehouse, and it's where they had done digs to find evidence of Stiegel glass there. Iron doesn't survive too well in that maritime environment, so they didn't find any iron. Now we have to talk about Manheim, town where I live. Manheim was established in 1762, part of that 729-acre tract that originally came from William Penn's sons. It was developed with a lovely town square well suited for public events, much like Manheim, Germany. It was patterned after Manheim, Germany, and I'm having trouble now seeing. It was patterned after Manheim, Germany, and it appealed to German immigrants because they were familiar with Manheim, Germany. He wanted Manheim, Pennsylvania to follow in that vein because he knew he would need to attract those skilled craftsmen. So here you can see an image, probably the oldest image that there is of the town of Manheim. And at the far end, you see that white circle. That encircles Stiegel's office at the west end of the square. His mansion was at the east end of the square, and you see an artist's depiction here of the mansion. The mansion still actually stands in Manheim today, but it was dramatically renovated in the late 1800s. They added a story and Victorianized it, so you don't notice it much like it would be in the 18th century. If you look at the south wall that you see in this drawing, if you look closely, you can see the glazed header brick on that wall, and the outline of where windows and doors and so forth were. The rain table was still on that side, so there are remnants. But that was an important feature of the town when it was first built. You'll notice there's a railing on the roof. The roof was designed to hold a band on the roof so it could perform for public events on the square, using some of those instruments that I talked about. So Stiegel was creating a town, yes, for his workmen at the glass factory, but he was creating a community that would be appealing for them as well. Now, he also included faith in the community. Faith was important to him. He was involved with many churches, and we can maybe turn the lights on. Maybe I'll see better. Let's try that for a while. He provided for space for a church in Manheim. You can see here an image of the first church for Zion Lutheran at the cost of 1 red rose a year as the rental. And that church, you see the current church steeple in the lower picture. They continue that event today in June. They give a rose to heirs of the Stiegel family. He was also involved in sharing faith for his workers through having church services in the second floor of his home at Elizabeth Furnace, and also at his mansion in Manheim. And he was involved in bringing preachers to these churches, doing music in these churches, and so forth, all a part of enhancing the community that he had for his workers. So the American flint glass manufacturing. Glassmaking was started in Manheim. He actually built 2 glass factories in Manheim. He was believed to have started practicing glassmaking at Elizabeth Furnace, and his brother Anthony was in charge of that effort. But he opened his first glass factory in Manheim in 1765 at a cost of £1,400, which today would be probably over $2 million. And the first year he raised a little over £500 in revenue. He expanded that factory in 1769 and went to England to get products and equipment to accomplish that. Eventually, he would employ 133 people in the glass factory operation. Now think back, this is before the Revolutionary War. What industries were there in the colonies that would employ that many people? That was more than twice as many as Cornwall Iron Furnace employed. It was quite an unusual accomplishment for an immigrant from Germany to establish a new town and a new business and industry. In 1772, his glass was endorsed by the American Philosophical Society. Who started that society? Ben Franklin. The factory manufactured a wide variety of decorative and functional tableware, window glass, bottles, even toys and scientific instruments. He made pieces for David Rittenhouse. You think of Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. He was maybe you could say he was Bill Gates of 18th century America. He was involved with helping establish the Mason-Dixon line, and he was the one who did the calculations for that curve in Pennsylvania in the bottom right-hand corner of the state. So he ordered glass products from Stiegel that he would be using in his scientific experiments. Here you see an artist's depiction of what the first glass factory may have looked like. Glass products produced. Here you see a variety of examples of what he did. His artisans were able to do copper wheel engraving, enamel decoration, blow molding, and so forth. Some of his glass items were exchanged for the illegal French goods that we talked about earlier. He even made toys. You see here a toy horn. I can't imagine many of those surviving to the 21st century, but this one did. Glass factory closure. The second glass factory was completed in 1769 with a 90-foot high dome. And you can see here a picture of the La Granja Royal Glass Factory, which is north of Madrid, Spain, but it operated at the same time, and maybe gives you an idea of what the second glass factory looked like in Manheim. He had 60 agents that were selling glass for him in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. At one time, he had over 60,000 items on consignment in these various cities. However, shifting markets right before the Revolutionary War, people didn't want fancy glass anymore. They wanted bullets and cannons and guns and so forth. By that time, he had divested most of his interests in the iron business, and he was unable to continue the sales of his glass, to the point that he ended up in debtor's prison in Philadelphia just for about a month. And you can see here an image of a document that the Manheim Historical Society was able to purchase about 2 years ago from the William DuPont estate. It's a 14-page document signed by John Penn, which was the justification for bringing Stiegel out of the jail in Philadelphia. So others tried to rent the glass operation and continue it on, but they were unsuccessful as well. And by the early 1800s, the glass factory was torn down, and I've heard comments that the brick may have been used for a hotel in Neffsville. Despite his misfortune, Henry established one of the first major industries in America. He established an appealing community of Manheim, which survives to this day after several economic and industrial evolutions. Henry remained a contributor to the country, though there was embarrassment with going to jail and going bankrupt. He remained, and he continued to be active in the local community through church involvement, through teaching, through his musical involvement, through industrial experience, and he continued as an important part of the community, which he truly loved. Stiegel continued on with Elizabeth Furnace after he was out of prison, and he was involved with German prisoners of war that were captured at Trenton, and through Robert Coleman, who took over operation of the furnace and its ownership, he had a relationship with General Edward Hand to secure 70 Hessian prisoners of war to help them at the furnace. Well, what did they do? They didn't know ironmaking. Henry Stiegel did. But they used these Hessian prisoners to dig a ditch around Cannon Hill, 1.5 miles long, to bring additional water from a nearby creek added to Furnace Run so as to increase the capacity of Elizabeth Iron Furnace for the production of cannonballs and so forth. Here you can see the Stiegel portion of the mansion. Behind that is another structure that has a cupola on top. Stiegel's office is where the cupola is, and behind that are the Hessian barracks. You can see an interior view of the barracks there, and it's pretty much the way it was. Those logs that you see going across were to support multiple layers of bunks. And in the bottom basement level, that's not a fireplace in there, that's a solitary cell. And there's a picture also of what remains of the Hessian ditch today. It doesn't actually carry water, but it does catch the surface water running down from the hill. If you know where to look on Google Earth, you can find it on Google Earth. Schaefferstown connection. Can't hardly avoid talking about Schaefferstown since we're here. Fountain Park Hill was the location of what we call as the Cannon Tower. I believe it was 50 foot square, 70 foot tall. You can see an artist's depiction of what that might have looked like. He had another cannon tower at Elizabeth Furnace. Here you can see a map. 501 goes up between those two mountains or hills. The one on the right is Cannon Hill, and where that red circle is the estimated location of the tower there. Now, I've been up on that hill with several people several times looking for where the tower might have been. There's a lot of rock up there, big rocks, some of them are bigger than a car, and it's evidence that they were quarrying rock there for building purposes, but we haven't found definitively where the cannon tower was located yet. We might still. Many people have made romantic stories about Stiegel, calling him Baron Stiegel, and had a coach in 6th or 8th and so forth, and announcing his arrival when he came into Schaefferstown or came into Manheim. I'd like to have people think a little bit differently about that story. Think of what Stiegel accomplished and what he had to do to accomplish establishing the town, building the glass factories, and his work at the iron furnace, international market for his products, marketing glassware all over the eastern seaboard. He was a busy man, and he was in demand. If they ran into a problem at Elizabeth Furnace, and he was at Manheim working out problems at the glass factory, they needed him pronto, and they couldn't pick up a cell phone or even a telegraph to get a hold of him. So using a signal cannon to alert him that, hey, we need you up here, that was a way to acknowledge that his involvement was needed. So he'd go on from Manheim to Schaefferstown, and of course the people heard the cannon, and then no sooner would Stiegel arrive, and they related to announcing his arrival. It was more likely to be used as a signaling method to get him from one place to another where he was needed. Also, I wanted to mention St. Luke's Church over here in the corner. You'll notice here this bottle has an image of a building on it. Typical architecture for churches of the day, like St. Luke's. Above that church is a dove flying downward with an envelope in the dove's mouth. It's pretty unusual, isn't it? Well, back in that day, it was not unusual for lotteries to be established for certain projects. A lot of churches were built by having a lottery and selling tickets. I could envision Henry Stiegel being involved and interested in local churches by making bottles like this to provide as a premium for people who would buy X number of lottery tickets. as an enhancement to the sale of the tickets. I'd love to find documentation to prove that. Haven't found it yet, but I'm still looking. Now, I can't end this program without talking a little bit about Manheim and the Historical Society. Manheim Historical Society brought back glass manufacturing back at the bicentennial in 1976 on the square, and in more recent years the Stiegel Glass Works got going, and it's located right behind the railroad station in Manheim. They do instructive lessons and classes, and they do custom creations. They do like awards for sports teams and things like that. So very creative, good group of people there that work throughout the year on that project. Also visit the Manheim Railroad Station. It was renovated in 2007. It's a main program area for the Historical Society. If you come there, you can actually ride on the Bernie trolley, which took people to Lancaster and to Rocky Springs Park. It has its own little garage next to the railroad station. We have a model railroad set up there that depicts locations in Manheim and nearby areas. And we have a wonderful collection of Stiegel glass, of Stiegel iron from the iron furnace, and we have one of only 3 Cannon stoves in the world there at the collection at the railroad station. We have the Phasic House, which is a log house saved from destruction, and it contains a lot of antiques, artifacts from the 19th century. It's right across the street from the Zion Lutheran Church, the Red Rose Church. And next to it, we have the Keith House, which has been relocated there and restored back to a typical 18th century log home in Manheim. On the 2 oldest streets in Manheim, Main Street, which once was Prussian Street, and Charlotte Street, we have over 24 log homes that are still intact and still being used today. In fact, one of them is for sale. And we also have the Heritage Center. We have a lot of records there, also more artifacts. We have a clock collection. Manheim was a bit of a clock-making center in the 18th and the early 19th century, and we have some fine examples there. So hope you can join us sometime. Lastly, it was suggested that I bring some items of Stiegel glass, and as I've collected over the years, I've gotten things that are more likely to be Stiegel glass, but the challenge is they're very expensive, and I'm leery of dragging them around from place to place. But I have these 2 artifacts that I brought that have been found at the archeological work that is ongoing at Elizabeth Furnace, and I'll pass these around. This is a stem from a cotton stem wine glass. Now, we don't know if that's Stiegel glass for sure, but it was found right outside the stone wall of the formal gardens of the mansion. So I can imagine the glass being broken in a party. They pitched it over the wall, and believe it or not, when they were preparing the property for the event venue, they had big machines in to move earth and create a public parking area. And I was just roaming around the dirt piles there as they were doing that, and I ran across that, knew immediately what it was. And the other item is this piece of glass. When we found it, we thought it was a marble, but as we looked at it closer and looked at it with magnifying glass and thought about where we found it, which was right at the main opening of the furnace. The furnace had been torn down in the 1850s to a point. There's about 6 or 7 feet of the furnace stack remaining, and then it was just covered over with debris and forgotten about. So digging through all that debris at the main opening, we found this. At first we thought it was a marble, but in closer looking at it, we think it may have been either a piece of refuse glass from the glass making there, or maybe a knob on top of a lid, possibly. You look at it yourself, see what you think, and let me know what you think it might be. That concludes my program. Are there any questions? Yes. It's commonly used the term Stiegel type glass. When Stiegel's factory closed, his artisans left and went northwest, east, south to continue their craft in other locations. So when you find a piece of glass, it could have been made in Manheim, or it could have been made by those same craftsmen working elsewhere. There are a few designs that are considered strictly Stiegel. That would be a diamond daisy pattern. It was a wooden mold they used to blow bottles of that pattern, and it's not known that anyone else was using that particular mold. So we tend to think of diamond daisy patterns as Stiegel glass. Also, there's another thought too, that the knob on top of lids has a twist to it. Some people think that maybe that's a Stiegel, descriptive of a Stiegel piece of glass. It's better if you go by provenance, really. If you can identify the pattern of ownership, it's more likely to prove Stiegel that way. No, all of the personal effects were sold. He owed money, and they needed it. He must have had a wonderful collection of furnishings and so forth. I know there's a chair in Philadelphia that was attributed to him. The Danner Museum that once was in Manheim, that was bought by the Hershey Museum. They don't have the artifacts on display there, but they have a number of things from Stiegel, including murals that were in the mansion. They have a harpsichord, they have a number of pieces of glass, a door knocker, and so forth. Yes? Yes. I have, yes. It's a possibility. His artisans did have the skill to make things like that. Do they have any knowledge of where those things were made? Not that I've heard. Yeah. Yes.
Just regarding the output from the glass works, what percentage was decorative in nature and what percentage was utilitarian? Thinking about bottles and
Yes.
picture glass or bigger glass.
If you go by the number of items, probably bottle glass and window glass would be the largest in volume, because everybody needs them, uses them. That is a common product. As far as value of items, that's another story. Because things were selling so slow as leading up to the Revolutionary War, probably the bottle and window glass in total sales was probably much greater, would be my guess. A little bit, not much. Yeah. Yes.
Your thoughts on where there are lots of rumors. Think of the term forge.
Yes. Yeah, it's anybody's guess. I would tend to think, since ironmaster families were pretty close to one another, and it was family that had Charming Forge, that might be the likely place he is, but we don't know. Yes. Yes, good question. It was on South Charlotte Street and Stiegel Street, took up most of a block. And it was only recently I noticed on the map of the town from back then there were 2 lots that Stiegel owned south of the glass factory that were right against the creek. And I thought that was unusual, so I walked down there. I might have been there once in my lifetime since I've been there, since '87. And I found that there was the remnants of a raceway there by the creek. And it's a possibility that there was a mill there where they ground flint for use in the glass factory. So that's another thing that we have to research and find out more about. Yes? She did die later on. I don't know off the top of my head what the date was on that, but she remained here in Schaefferstown. Yes?
I read, and I don't know if this is true, but I read that
Okay, that's a new one to me.
I don't know if it's true, I read that.
Okay.
Well, I'm just saying, I don't know if it's speculation, but when I read that, I immediately, my eyes are buzzed, how you attended other talks about Stiegel, and all this came up, where's he buried? And the comment was always, you don't know, it's a mystery. But when I saw that, I thought, okay, well, I'll save the link,
Yes, Jan.
where did you get
I don't have any specifics on that. I don't know. Well, there's a lot of sandstone, and where sandstone was, there was sand. Yes. Charles and Alexander Stedman were the start of his capital, but there was an Isaac Cox involved, Daniel Benezant, I think, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, and there were others. But the Stedmans and Cox were probably the larger. No, not to our knowledge. It's nothing clear in documentations that he came with money. Yeah. 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 And yes. There aren't ancestors in this area so much anymore, but there are ancestors in New York and down south and various states. Yeah, there is a sufficient supply of ancestors to come to the Red Rose ceremony each year. They take turns. And, oh yes, yeah, yes. That was very common back then, not to mark your work, believe it or not. There were some, there wasn't a lot, but that was very common. Not just with glassware, but clockmakers and cabinet makers and Hercules Courtenay I mentioned earlier. They didn't sign their work so much, which is amazing. Maybe we learned from our ancestors to do a better job of that today. Yes. Oh, yes, the Stiegel House. Well, probably there are people here that can speak much more to that than I can. But just up the street here is the Stiegel House. It was the home of Stiegel's mother and brother, I take it. Also, it was likely that Stiegel may have lived in the Cannon Tower building here south of town for a time after he got out of prison. And I didn't mention, in Manheim, when the British invaded Philadelphia, people left for security reasons, and Robert Morris, who was the financier of the Revolutionary War, lived in the Stiegel mansion for, I think, a little more than a year. And across the street, in another house, Ben Franklin's daughter, Sarah Bache, lived as well. They considered Manheim a suitable town, comfortable enough to live in, but it was kind of at the edge of civilization, a much safer place in Philadelphia at that point. Yes, Diane. Yes. Yes. Yes, he was. Faith was important to him. Well, thank you very much. You've been a very attentive group.